This is TWiT.
The brown liquor pick of the week, interestingly, I was just chatting with the person who brought you that Bushmills recently.
Oh, were you?
Yeah.
That was from last week.
Yeah, from last week. So what is the brown liquor pick of the week this week?
This week is a story. The whiskey that is listed in the sheet is not how the story is going to begin. The story is going to begin with a listener, Barry Wallace, who, while on a cruise, tweeted to me the menu of whiskeys available on his cruise and said, like, which one should I try? And I ran down a bunch of them that I recognized, but there was one on the list I hadn't seen. And this doesn't happen very often anymore. For better or worse, I'm pretty good at remembering things. And so if I had seen it before, I would have recognized it. But one of them on the list was called Macklowe, and which is called an American Single Malt Whiskey, which is interesting because the U.S. has no concept of a single malt whiskey, really. Single malt is an invention of Smith & Sons, Glenlivet, back in the 1960s, when they wanted to show that their product was more premium. It never really meant anything, although it was later codified, initially to be the idea that it was from a malting of barley, but in reality now really means a given distillery has produced and distilled all of the products that are in the bottle. So single malts don't mean as much as it is said. There's lots of pretentious folks that say, well, I'll only drink single malts, when I can make fun of them all day long. And in fact, here's one I'm going to make fun of. The lady's name is Julie Macklowe. Now, Julie originally from Aspen, but joined JP Morgan as a hedge fund manager, got bitten by the whiskey bug doing her work, but ultimately married an extremely wealthy person, Billy Macklowe, who is the son of one of the largest real estate tycoons in New York. So they get married back in 2004, and apparently she goes all in on being a socialite. In fact, there is an article in Vogue about her in 2009 called "The Hedge Funder in Thigh-High Boots." Anyway, and she likes whiskey, which is not a sin. You can be a socialite and like whiskey, like all of that is fine. But apparently during the pandemic, she had been buying up rare whiskeys because it was a lot of folks were unloading their collection because they needed money during the pandemic when everything was disrupted. And so there's a whole conversation to be had about the dusty bottle movement, that as the demand for whiskey skyrocketed during the pandemic, a lot of folks that had forgotten about their collections started dug into them and sold really rare whiskeys. And so she decided she should make whiskey and found a guy named Ian McMillan. Now, Ian McMillan is a proper master distiller. This is a guy who's pushing 50 years working in the whiskey industry, all the way back to Glengoyne in the 1970s. He's actually well known for rehabilitating older distilleries. So he helped get Deanston back on Rhine and Tobermory, Bunnahabhain down in Islay. And famously, he's best known at the moment for the Bladnoch distillery back in 2017, which is one of the very few lowland distilleries that exists. Like Ian McMillan is the guy. And actually at the moment he was working for a group called Wolf Craig Distillers. So they're making weird new things. But in between doing Bladnoch and this, he was recruited by Julie Macklowe. And they went out. She had an idea to make whiskey, but didn't actually want to make it. So instead, she found some that she could brand. And she found it from a distillery called Bull Run, which is out of Portland, Oregon. And so she bought literally one barrel, pure barley whiskey, which is relatively unusual in the United States, which normally uses corn, but this was 100% barley, aged in American oak. It had been barreled in 2014. She then removed that barrel from the storage in Oregon and put it for a couple of years in somewhere in Kentucky. I haven't been able to find out where, but one of the rick houses there's plenty. And then bottled it in 2021, an entire 271 bottles, which is typical for a single barrel, somewhere in there, somewhere between 200 up to 300, depends, which she promptly priced at $1,500 US each.
Woof.
Yeah. Now, being a socialite, this is someone who eats dinner out in New York at a top tier restaurant 5-6 times a week. So she had a pretty, and was, sociable with everyone around there. She's a socialite. So she pretty much sold the whiskey herself, going from fancy restaurant to fancy restaurant, getting this this $1,500 edition, which they call the Black Edition, out all over the place. You can also find it. Like I said, there's only a handful of bottles, although apparently they're making additional editions outside of New York, in some places in Texas, Los Angeles, Vegas, and Aspen, of course. Jean-Georges apparently was an early backer on this, so definitely got this strong restaurant bar tie for it. The professional whiskey people have tasted it. They have declared it a wood bomb, which is to say it has spent too long in wood, which is normal for anything that's gone 7-8 years in this part of the world. Tannic and bitter.
Oh, Lord. So not good.
I would point out that most photos related to this particular whiskey showed in a cocktail. In fact, apparently today, if you would like to, in New York, you can go to a very swanky club called Gabriel's. Well, they will sell you a $45 cocktail called the Gold Fashion.
Oh, sorry, what?
$45. Yeah. So made with
Gold
the
Fashion.
Black Edition. Yes. They recently have announced, as of last year, a new edition called the Kentucky Gold Edition. They've only been taking pre-orders, so nobody's actually tasted it, although the description of it is lovely, which, they call it tasting notes, except for that part where nobody's actually tasted it. And they're going to want $260 for this. That would be, by the way, more money than the retail price on a Pappy Van Winkle 23.
No way.
Yes.
Which is why I did not want to talk about this whiskey, when Barry led me to it. I hadn't seen before. Of course, I did the research, and I only got angrier and angrier and angrier reading this, until I went back to the root of this, which was Bull Run, right? That our friend Julie went and bought a barrel from Bull Run. And Bull Run is out of Portland, Oregon. It's been around since 2010. Lee Madoff, who worked his way through different breweries and different distilleries and so forth, set this up himself. He makes a variety of different whiskeys, but he makes a whiskey that very likely was the starting point of the Black Edition, called the Bull Run Single Malt. And he's also been part of the American Single Malt Whiskey Commission, which is trying to be establishing standards for what we would call an American single malt. By the way, that bottle, $50, which is more in line with the price of a whiskey should be. You'll find it up to 100. There's a few different editions of it. He makes a bourbon as well. He does a Pinot Noir aged whiskey, which I might just want to try, as well as some vodkas and things like that. It spends 5 years in oak, which is more appropriate for that climate. And it's more, and you can find it. It's buyable. It's at Bevmo, not a big deal. You're going to have a tough time finding any of the Macklowes, and I would recommend that you don't. Right? Why don't you drink the Origin product? You'll be happier. And the current specification for what an American single malt whiskey, so the American Single Malt Whiskey Commission is in the process of ratifying this standard. So that single malt whiskey means 100% malted barley from the U.S. So U.S. barley, distilled at a single distillery, same as they do in Scotland. Also aged in the U.S. and barrels no larger than 700 liters, and distilled no higher than 80% and bottled no less than 40%. These very similar to what Scottish single malt would represent as. And that's a far better story than anything to talk about from a New York socialite.
Amen.
Bull Run, Oregon, single malt whiskey. Portland is fun. Go get some.
Yes, Portland's great.
Yeah.
Well,
not like New York jerks.
You know what? Maybe I should apologize. I went on this ride, and now I've made you go on it too.
And we're all angry. That's why the lights are red.
Kind of the theme of the whole show, really. We went on this ride, and now you're going.
Now you're going on it. I started I was going to write about do the story about the Macklowe, and I was working my way through it. And I finally got to a point where I was like, I'm going to throw this away until I figured out where she got the whiskey from. And then when I read about Lee, I'm like, this guy's awesome. Yeah. This is what whiskey's about.
Here we go.